Welcome, fellow creatures of the night, to this meeting of the Midnight Culture Club. Here, we venture deep into the nocturnal lands of the strange, the morbid, the absurd, and the obscure in film, books, TV, fairy tales, urban legends, and many other forms of pop culture. We discuss and analyse these texts to explore the fascinating ways in which they reflect, comment on, and critique the world we live in from its darker side. I am Xenia, the over-motivated nerd who sometimes lets other members get a word in, but not today, and I declare this meeting of the Midnight Culture Club officially in session. And since we last met, time has moved. That's how time works. And the best period of the year, autumn season, has begun. So today's episode is appropriately cozy and a little mysterious, but it also contains a bit of a history lesson. But before you run away now, the history lesson is very on theme as well. Nothing to do with ancient Greek agriculture or complicated treaties, but with the supernatural and the occult. Because today we're going to talk about a book by the brilliant author Shirley Jackson, who you might know because she wrote The Haunting of Hill House. That was adapted as a TV series a few years ago. Apparently, the series drove people crazy because it was so scary. Personally, it only drove me crazy because it took a beautiful, subtle, and clever book and used its title for a run-off-the-mill family moves into haunted house horror featuring dead lady with long black hair like hundreds of others. But at least it had some interesting subplot about the family, so that's good. But it was nothing at all to do with the book it's allegedly based on, so that was a bit disappointing, and we should be suing Netflix. But anyway, today is not the day to complain about Netflix shows. That's in 2 weeks' time. Spoilers. Today we talk about a different book by Shirley Jackson that is just as spellbindingly and hauntingly beautiful as Hill House. We're going to talk about her final novel, We Have Always Lived in the Castle, about its fascinating protagonist and about the way the book paints a vibrant picture of how legends grow from the need to explain tragedy that there is no explanation for. There aren't any common trigger topics in this episode. What will be discussed that could be upsetting is the death of family members. This is very general and not at all graphic. And there will also be mention of a house fire, which is a bit more detailed but relatively brief. So these are the two things to watch out for if any of that affects you. Yeah, that's all I have to say before we can start. So yeah, without any further ado, let's begin. Come, children, come here. I'll tell you a story. You two, Tommy, stop tormenting that squirrel and sit down. Listen. This is the story of Constance and Merricat Blackwood, who, some say, still live behind the burned walls of the house. If you look carefully, you can catch a glimpse of it, of the ancestral Blackwood home, there, beyond the lawn, shaded by the oak trees and cloaked almost completely in the poison ivy that has grown on the blackened stone, brick and mortar for many years. And do you know, children, why the house was burned down? It all began a long, long time ago when I myself was a young girl. You weren't born, and the Blackwoods were still alive. Constance Blackwood, the family's older daughter, was a wonderful cook. She prepared the most delicious meals for her family. She baked sweet pies and fluffy soufflés, conjured up hearty soups and fragrant sauces, until one night, when the whole Blackwood family, mother and father, uncles and aunts, and the two daughters, were gathered at the large dinner table in the dining room with the old fireplace that is never lit anymore. That night, Constance put poison in the sugar bowl. The whole family died, except Constance herself, her little sister Merricat, and an old uncle who survived with lasting damage. The murderous Constance held him captive in the house where he'd suffered the loss of his wife and his brother until he died years later on the night of the fire. Why didn't Constance go to prison for killing her family? That's a good question, Tommy. Well, there was a trial, but she was acquitted. They say there was no evidence, no proof that she had poisoned the sugar, even though everybody knows it must have been her. Surely they hadn't poisoned themselves, and it can't very well have been Merricat, who was only 12 at the time. Besides, who knows better how to poison than a cook, with a garden full of herbs and mushrooms at her fingertips and all the diners at her mercy? After Constance was acquitted, the girls withdrew further and further away from the town and into the depths of the old house. For a while we used to see Merricat in town twice a week to shop for groceries. How she could still eat any of the food Constance cooked, I don't know. The poor girl must have been terrified. She spoke to no one when she came into the village, except for the shop owners and Stella, who runs the cafe. Merricat was a strange girl, very strange. Something a little wild in her, with her hair that was never brushed, and the old brown shoes she always wore that were far too big. Then, one year in spring, a cousin came to visit the Blackwood sisters. I can't really remember his name, John or Charles or something like it. A fine young man, I thought when I saw him drive into town. And he wanted to bring the girls back into the world, to open that tomb of a house to a bit of light and fresh air, but they wouldn't have it. They took him in, but no one else. Some say he was after their money, that he tried very hard to get the safe out of the house later when it stood in flames, but I don't think so. He was charming. Well, while he stayed with the girls, and nobody really knows how it happened, a fire broke out. It broke out in the young man's bedroom and spread to the rest of the house. I have never seen anything like it, before or after, the whole house burning brightly, golden red and hissing hot white, and the temperature was almost impossible to stand. But that didn't stop people from all over the town, everyone, to come and see. We all stood on the lawn and watched the wretched house burn. The firemen came and put out the flames, and I remember how one woman, standing quite close to me, kept saying that they should let it burn. I don't know if she was right or wrong. And after the fire was out, something changed. The house was no longer a private, enclosed place that no one dared enter. No. The people descended on it in a rage. They rushed in through the open front door and smashed the furniture in pure madness. They tore pictures from the walls and bricks from bricks. My brother said he himself ripped the shelves off the kitchen walls, threw them to the ground, and loved the sound of the teacups shattering. I didn't go in. I was scared. And then they found the old man, the uncle, dead. Some say Constance killed him too. Finished off what she started, but the doctor said he died of natural causes. It was the doctor, too, who sent everyone away. It was not a fine hour for this town, but it was unavoidable. Someone had to pay the price for the horrible crime that had taken place in the Blackwood house. And because Constance could sneak her way out of it, it was the house itself that had to pay. They say that Constance is still there, deep within the blackened walls. And Merricat as well, if she isn't dead. No one has seen them since the night of the fire, but they must be there. They sit in the dark, between the ashes and the fallen stones, waiting. What for? Nobody knows. But don't get too close. They might get you too. What you should do, though, is listen. Listen very closely, because sometimes, on quiet nights when the owls hold their breath and even the wind falls silent, you can hear their voices echoing through the dark. Merricat, said Constance, would you like a cup of tea? Merricat, said Constance, would you like to go to sleep? Oh no, said Merricat, you'll poison me. Down in the boneyard. 10 feet. This sounds like a familiar story, doesn't it? Like the kind of local legend a friend might tell us in a hushed voice sitting by the campfire, or perhaps we hear it from the guide on a ghost tour in a quaint old town. It is, in broad strokes, the plot of Shirley Jackson's novel We Have Always Lived in the Castle, as it might be retold by the inhabitants of the nameless village where the book takes place. It is not the story that We Have Always Lived in the Castle tells. Because this story comes from an entirely different perspective than that of the children playing on the lawn, trying to get a glimpse behind the terrifying overgrowth, or of the parents telling them not to step on the veranda. The story is told from within the walls of the Blackwood house, by someone who sits at the core around which the vines of local legend grow. It is the younger surviving daughter, Merricat, and this is how she begins. My name is Mary Catherine Blackwood. I am 18 years old and I live with my sister, Constance. I have often thought that with any luck at all, I would have been born a werewolf, because the two middle fingers on both my hands are the same length, but I have had to be content with what I have. I dislike washing myself, and dogs, and noise. I like my sister Constance, and Richard Plantagenet, and Amanita phalloides, the deathcap mushroom. Everyone else in my family is dead. From these opening lines, we can already tell quite a bit about Merricat. First of all, she's still very young, on the cusp between childhood and adulthood. And she's clearly an unusual person, with a sense for the fantastic and the morbid. She wishes she'd been born a werewolf, considers it a disappointment that she's not. This can be read as her identifying with the wild, untamed, supernatural, and with the animalistic. In fact, throughout the book, we see that Merricat is a bit of a feral child. She spends most of her time roaming the forest surrounding the Blackwood house with her companion, the cat Jonas. Sometimes they hunt for rabbits together, and she sleeps in hiding places under leaves and twigs. Merricat also has a tendency to be impulsive and have violent thoughts in which the people who have wronged her, or who she thinks have wronged her, die, usually in masses. Alongside this feral, wild werewolf line, Merricat opens up associations with the magical, with witchcraft perhaps. In the opening of the book, this is hinted at by her pointing out that she likes the deathcap mushroom, that is fatally poisonous. And throughout the story, Merricat references other poisonous mushrooms and plants that she knows a lot about. She actually uses this knowledge in a pretty iconic way to scare the cousin, Charles Blackwood, not John, Charles, by casually dropping comments about plant poison while they are eating dinner, a situation that in this novel is loaded already, given that the rest of the family were poisoned at dinner, so Charles really freaks out. But before you feel bad for Charles, don't. He deserves it. He's the kind of guy who mansplains your own job to you and then tells you should be a housewife anyway because that's what nature made you for, and then he tries to rob you. But back to Merricat and her wild witchy wolfy vibes. The fact that her companion, who she really treats as an equal, always speaking about Jonas and I as a cat, also references the traditional figure of the witch that from medieval and early modern times was associated with cats. In European and North American settler beliefs, witches were thought to transform into cats or to be accompanied by them. Now, interestingly, there is another type of animal witches were, in some regions, linked to, and that is wolves and werewolves. In the description, you can find an article by Jane Davidson that examines this link between belief in witches, werewolves, and enchanted wolves that was pretty firmly established in early modern Europe, so from the 1500s to the 1700s roughly, especially in the German-speaking and other alpine areas. Most texts about witchcraft from this period contain a section about werewolves. This is basically a staple, although quite a few of these texts dispute that werewolves existed and claimed that people who described themselves as werewolves had been sent delusions by the devil. It's always the devil. But the belief in werewolves as real malefactors was deeply rooted in the population. Davidson outlines several reports from witch trials in Switzerland, or Germany and Austria as well, for example, where the alleged witches were accused of riding on enchanted wolves or humans transformed into wolves, or using them to do their evil bidding. Now, those enchanted wolves aren't exactly the same thing as werewolves. In early modern belief, werewolves weren't simply humans transmuted into wolf form, but they had to be doing harm to qualify for their proper werewolf club membership card. So they had to attack livestock or people, often children, to be seen as werewolves. So no werewolf membership card for some of the Twilight werewolves, sorry. Especially killings of large numbers of animals or people were often attributed to werewolf activity. These creatures were also sometimes linked to sexual violence, incest, or cannibalism, although I'm not sure if it's cannibalism if you're a werewolf eating people. Like, wouldn't you have to eat other werewolves? I don't know. But if you're a werewolf cannibalism expert, please enlighten me. I would like to know. For these kinds of violent acts, people believed to be werewolves were put on trial, similar to witches. So, because of this link between werewolves and extreme violent crime, modern scholarship often interprets the werewolf belief as an explanation for violent, aggressive behavior that didn't have an objective motive like revenge or financial reasons, but that might have been connected with something more obscure like emotional regulation issues or mental illness. And We Have Always Lived in the Castle, this connection between werewolves and witches and inexplicable aggression survives in a way. Because not only does Merricat, who has aggressive impulses, identify with a werewolf and have a lot of witchy knowledge, she also explicitly talks about practicing magic. Merricat has a complicated set of rules of where she's allowed to go, which places and activities are safe and which aren't. And in order to keep the safe areas safe, she puts in place safeguards and talismans that she herself calls magical. She buries dolls and silver dollars in the woods to protect her territory against intruders and against change. She nails a book that belonged to her father to a tree to ward off bad luck. Marbles she buried at the end of a field are meant to shield the house from harm. And Merricat chooses special words that, as long as they are not spoken, work as a spell that protects her and Constance against outsiders. Overall, Merricat is very concerned with safety. She doesn't trust anyone except Constance and their uncle Julian. She speaks a lot about keeping safe and she will defend her home, herself and her sister with everything she has. You'll see in a moment how far she'll go to do so. Merricat is especially defined when it comes to protecting Constance, and Constance needs protected. In the local lore about the murder of the Blackwood family by the infamous poison in the sugar bowl, Constance takes the role of the villain. After all, it was only her who didn't take any sugar on her blackberries at dessert on that fateful night. And it was her who got up and washed the sugar bowl, destroying every last trace of evidence, while her relatives sat dying at the dinner table. Because of this, the disdain, the hatred of the villagers is directed at her. But the Constance the reader encounters through the lens of Merricat's narration makes this vilification appear rather doubtful. Constance, as her name suggests, is mild-natured, reliable, and patient. She looks after Uncle Julian, who has never recovered from the poisoning and has lived with the girls since. She cooks him anything he asks for with love and great care, cleans his room every day, spends time with him in the garden, tending her vegetables while he sits in his wheelchair enjoying the sun. Constance is all kindness and gentleness, never even loses her nerve with her eccentric, impulsive little sister. At most, she softly calls her silly Merricat, even when Merricat speaks of wanting to send everyone except them to hell. If anything, Constance is a little too nice for her own good. Because when Charles Blackwood shows up at their door, Constance welcomes him in with open arms, despite Merricat's warnings that there is something wrong with their cousin. Even when Charles begins to dig through the drawers looking for jewellery and spends whole days searching for the safe containing the family fortune, Constance doesn't say one bad word about him. She doesn't realise when he tries to drive a wedge between the sisters, because surely he wouldn't do such a thing. And it is this, him trying to separate the sisters, that sets off the escalation within the novel. One evening, Charles suggests that he and Constance should move away together and essentially leave Merricat to fend for herself. And what can I say? You do not mess with Merricat. You really don't, if you value your life. Because this evening, Merricat goes up to his bedroom and, very simply, tips his still burning pipe into the waste paper basket. By the time Charles notices smoke and goes upstairs to check, the top floor of the house is engulfed in flames. Fortunately, Constance and Merricat, and I guess also Charles, make it outside in time. Uncle Julian dies, but seemingly not because of the fire, but by natural causes. As the firefighters do their best to put out the flames, Constance and Merricat have to watch the villagers gather in front of their home, delighted to see it burn, and even more delighted to rip it to shreds when the fire is out. The sisters hide in Merricat's den in the woods until the people are gone, and then return to what is left of their home. They swipe away the debris and the ashes, nail the leftover windows shut. Merricat barricades the way around the house so that no one will see them again, ever. And there they stay, by themselves in their own little realm that Merricat calls the moon. And who do you think killed the family all those years ago? It is only mentioned very briefly, not even spelled out, but hinted at, after the flames take the sisters home. Merricat, of course, the werewolf girl, furious because she was sent to bed upstairs before everybody else, and apart from Constance, her favourite, she poisoned them all. Her whole family, who she loved, and as a girl of 12 years old. This is incomprehensible to anyone but her. And so the stories that the people tell themselves get it wrong. And the legends grow quicker than ever around the house and the Blackwood girls. After the fire and the sisters retreat to the moon, the house becomes a haunted attraction, a place where children go to test their courage, terrified of the ladies who their mothers say will eat them. The house morphs into the site of a cautionary tale, a place where reality and story merge further into each other. From behind the blackened walls, Constance and Merricat hear fragments of the stories told about them by the people who come to see the place of tragedy that to them is home. So Merricat says, "We watched the children playing and the people walking past, and we heard their voices, and they were all strangers with their wide staring eyes and their evil open mouths." Merricat describes the people's mouths as open and evil, and I find that very interesting because I think this hints at how the stories that come from these mouths, these open evil mouths that talk about them, become more malicious as time passes. And she's right about that. We see that reflected in the comments that the people that come to the house make. So, for example, a woman who goes there with her friend and their respective children to picnic on the lawn. That's, by the way, where Tommy from the intro story comes from. He's one of the kids there. So these families picnic on the lawn in front of the house, and the mother tells the children not to step too close to the veranda. And she says, because the ladies live in there and they don't like it. The ladies don't like little boys. They'd hold you down and make you eat candy full of poison. I heard that dozens of bad little boys have gone too near to that house and never been seen again. They never come out except at night, and when it's dark, they go hunting little children. So from oh, these girls, or one of these girls, probably killed their family, we get to something like they hunt and eat children, which is a bit of an escalation, I would say. But it is how these kinds of stories work, right? But I think this is one of the first times I've seen these familiar sort of ghost stories, these local legends, to seem received by the people they are about. And that sort of reveals how cruel these tales can be. From the person within the abandoned house, the evil that is inscribed into it through storytelling must feel like an insult. But at the same time, it is these stories, especially the cautionary ones, that also keep them safe, that draw an invisible boundary that must not be crossed by anyone, and that makes sure that Merricat and Constance are not discovered. It's fascinating how it works into two directions. At the same time, the stories, of course, have a morbid attraction to the people of the area. So repeatedly, Merricat and Constance observe young couples that meet in this secluded spot, but not without fear of the ladies being able to see them, because it seems they have also acquired perfect night vision and being able to see through walls, which I think is pretty cool. But of course, tests of courage for the local children, which is probably the most popular use for haunted locations anywhere, cannot be resisted, and we get a charming little paragraph about this at the end that I love. So the children are talking to each other and they say, "You can't go on those steps," the children warned each other. "If you do, the ladies will get you." Once a boy dared by the others, and this is Merricat's narration again, once a boy dared by the others stood at the foot of the steps watching the house, and shivered and almost cried and almost ran away, and then called out shakily, "Merricat," said Constance, "would you like a cup of tea?" and then fled, followed by all the others. So the house, this location, becomes a focal point, a central point of this local legend, of course, because we love haunted houses. You can inscribe all sorts of stories into them, and I think that's why haunted house tales are so popular to this day. You know, an abandoned house, a mysterious house, is a place in which you could imagine anything happening, right? And at the same time, as we see here, it's relatively accessible for people in the area. It's a place you can simply go to and see what happens. And so, of course, it draws in stories and it draws in these tales. And with every person that goes there, maybe a new tale follows, who knows? But at this point, I would like to return the focus from the house to the Blackwood girls themselves again. I've talked a little bit about the roles they are ascribed within the local legends, and the contrasting way that Merricat's narration draws her sister and herself. This all ties into a historic form of myth-making that has existed across cultures and time periods, but that reached one of its peaks in Europe and in North America in the early modern period. Already talked about early modern period. But this form of myth-making is the use of fictionalized stories in this specific context of maybe of the horrific and the magical and the occult to explain misfortune. And I've already touched on this a little bit regarding Merricat and the witches and the werewolves, but I'd like to dig deeper. Maybe dig up some dead relatives. No, we're not gonna do that. Let's start with Constance, the figure at the very core of this storytelling. Now, very importantly, not only Constance's character, but the straight up fact that Merricat killed the family show that there is a massive disconnect between reality and the stories that people tell themselves and each other. Because the reality that a 12-year-old girl murdered her family over basically nothing is so absurd that neither the authorities who charge Constance nor the people in the village even think of it, because why would they? In their worldview, it is impossible that a child would commit a crime like that, and it is relatively unlikely, I would say. But someone has to be responsible for this tragedy. And so the collective narrative searches for someone likely. And Constance, who is an unmarried young woman who is relatively independent, who devotes her time to the study of plants and artful cooking, she fits the bill of the killer rather well. In fact, she fits a specific archetype, that of the witch. We've got the witches again, but this is a little bit different than with Merricat, you'll see. Here we're back into History Corner. I'm sure you've all heard of witch trials and witch hunts. I mean, I also literally mentioned them earlier on, but you know. Here I'm focusing on the European and European American strands because that is Shirley Jackson's background as a white American woman. But beliefs in witches and persecution of witches has existed in many, many cultures across the world and still is actively pursued in some places. But in this context that we're talking about here, witch trials in, again, these European or European American circles are generally seen by historians, and this is argued in all the secondary sources you can find in the description, to have been responses to either natural disasters, outbreaks of disease, or crimes that people wanted to explain and hold someone accountable for, but they couldn't. Because either there was no single person responsible, as with natural disasters or disease, there's not one person you can blame for that, usually, or because the responsible person in a crime couldn't be identified, which was a very difficult thing to do at the time. The only way you could identify a criminal was if somebody had seen the crime and that person was trustworthy, or there was a confession from the criminal. So, what often happened was that a person who everybody already thought was a bit weird, often a woman who was unmarried or knew a bit too much about medicine, or simply couldn't really defend herself because she didn't have family, or she was maybe a little bit excluded from the community, was blamed. And in many cases, people also accused others of witchcraft because they had personal conflicts and wanted to get these people that they had conflicts with in trouble. Which is a little bit unhinged because it could literally get them killed. So, maybe if somebody pissed you off because they, I don't know, stole your butter. I don't know what kind of fights people had in early modern times. It seems a bit harsh to accuse them of something that could get them executed. But people did that. There are a lot of reports of that actually happening. And as a result of these processes, as I'm sure you've heard before, thousands of innocent people were tortured and many executed in witch trials across Europe and North America. And I think to a lesser extent, this is the same kind of mechanism of what is happening to Constance. She is the most likely suspect. She fits the witch archetype just enough, as this relatively independent woman who knows so much about these plants. She lives in this house with her family that's a bit secluded from the rest of the town. Her family's not super popular either. So, she's someone who could plausibly be blamed, and therefore she is put on trial legally and, more importantly, within the community. So, even though she is acquitted, she can not escape the scrutiny and the prejudice of the community after this ever again. All that is left for her is to withdraw and to hide, which in turn gives more room for speculations and stories to circulate. The fact that her kind, shy, nurturing, even slightly naive personality don't really fit an act like this doesn't matter. It's a good story because it is a familiar story and it is a plausible explanation that makes people feel secure, like they know what's going on and they can do something about it, like shun the person chosen to be guilty. This role is pushed on Constance and there's not much she can do about it. With Merricat, the situation becomes a bit more complicated. She isn't the person that the local tales, the chatter, and the gossip center on. She is not the one who's made responsible for her family's deaths. Merricat does become part of the mythology surrounding the Blackwood house as a haunted place, but even in the nursery rhyme, she does not play a negative role. On the contrary, she is the victim, who fears being poisoned by her sister. So, on a first level, we once again see the lore misreading the situation entirely by swapping the roles of the guilty and the innocent, the roles of Constance and Merricat. That we've established, but there is more. Earlier on, we talked about how Merricat associates herself with magic and with occult practices. Specifically, she engages in witchy rituals, she has a cat companion, a familiar one might say, and she identifies with the figure of the werewolf. This means that she appropriates for herself typical markers of the supernatural scapegoat, like we see it in this early modern lore. And that far we've already been. But if we peel back another layer on Merricat with the knowledge that she killed her family and burned down her own home, and look at her identification with the witch and the werewolf now, the text points us towards the reason why she might be doing this. And for this point, I'd like to do a little excursion and draw a parallel to a specific historic case of a werewolf trial. This trial took place in France in the early 1600s. The information about this is from an episode of the Not Just the Tudors podcast with the historian Jan Machielsen, which I hope I'm saying right. I'm not sure, I think it's a Dutch name, who specializes in beliefs about the supernatural in early modern times. Oops. Jan Machielsen reconstructed a detailed account of this trial from several sources, and through this unearthed a lot of information about the people involved. So, in said werewolf trial, the accused was a 13-year-old boy, Jean Grenier. He was charged with having killed livestock, having killed several children, and having attacked at least one other girl, all while in the form of a wolf. And he'd confessed to all of these crimes. Now, Jean Grenier had, a few months prior to his werewolf era, run away from home to get away from his violent father. Jean was taken in by a farmer who gave him a job herding sheep. While out herding sheep, Jean met 3 teenage girls and, wanting to get their attention and to impress them, told them that he could transform into a wolf with the help of a magical wolf skin, and that he was, therefore, a werewolf. That was a terrible idea, because the girls reported him and Jean was arrested and interrogated. The boy kept insisting that he was a werewolf and started adding all sorts of details, like that his father was a werewolf too, and that together they'd hunted for girls. It is kind of unclear why he added all this stuff, but it was believed that he, genuinely thought he was a werewolf. And because he stuck to his confessions, Jean was made responsible for the killing of livestock and the deaths of the children that he'd been charged with. And in real life, these had probably been actual wolf attacks. That's the most likely option. So he confessed to all of them, and because of that was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. The only reason he wasn't executed was his young age, which is quite interesting. That age already played a role in how harshly people were punished at the time. I didn't really expect that to be taken into account back then, but that's not really the point. What is important in relation to Merricat is that the historian Jan Machielsen points out that it seems that Jean Grenier genuinely believed he was a werewolf, and that he probably used this identification with this dangerous supernatural creature to explain feelings of aggression and sexual confusion that he would have probably felt as a 13-year-old. So someone beginning puberty who had experienced violence at home and was struggling because of these experiences. And as an example for, these kinds of feelings possibly being present, Machielsen states that Jean Grenier said to one of the 3 girls who had been bitten by a wolf earlier on that this wolf had been him, and that he wishes he had bitten her harder, which has kind of a bit of like a sexual undertone, I guess. It does seem a bit weird, and like he deliberately wants to be powerful and threatening. I think we can probably say that it was meant to be sort of threatening. The fact that he said that he and his father hunted specifically for girls could also suggest a certain sexualized aggression. Now, this is Machielson's reading, and while we cannot, officially back this up because we can't ask the people who were there, and maybe they don't know themselves if we could ask them, I do think it's a pretty plausible interpretation. And if we accept this reading, we see a teenager who identifies with the figure of the werewolf, a figure that represents unbridled aggression and uncontrollable emotion, and he identifies with this figure in order to make sense of negative emotionality, of probably anger and a lack of control that he doesn't have any other explanation for. So we see how the concept of finding a supernatural explanation for things that don't have an evident rational reason behind them, like random feelings of aggression, like perhaps Merricat's sudden rage at her family that motivated her to poison them, her anger at Charles that made her set the house on fire, how a supernatural explanation for these kinds of obscure things can be applied by a person to themselves. And I think it's interesting that it's a very young person doing it in both cases. I think that kind of fits someone who's, maybe not fully matured yet, who can't really examine these things in a different way. And I think that Merricat might, like Jean Grenier, prefer to see herself as a wild, supernatural creature rather than as a regular human, because it helps her understand her own sudden outbursts of destructive aggression. This ties in very well, too, with her tendency to develop magical strategies to deal with her fears. Now, I've mentioned that she's very concerned about protection and staying safe. And her burying dolls and silver dollars in the woods to mark safe territory, nailing books to trees as protective talismans, coming up with magic words to keep her safe, all these things seem sort of witchy and occult, and she presents them as magic rituals. But realistically, they are probably coping mechanisms to make herself feel safe in the face of the fears that she has. To make herself feel that she can do something to protect Constance and herself, if only she sticks to these rituals and rules that she believes in. And here we come full circle in a sense. Like, people in cultures across the world and across different time periods create stories to explain phenomena that they can't otherwise account for. Like the villagers who paint Constance as a witchy murderer because it is the most plausible explanation to them. Merricat creates a self-image shaped by supernatural elements in order to grasp her own self. Her outbursts, her aggression, her destructive behavior, her ritualized actions of protection that likely stem from psychological issues that she doesn't comprehend, they can all be neatly wrapped up in the comforting package of myth. In this, We Have Always Lived in the Castle is, among many other things, a story about stories themselves, where they come from and why we need them to keep our worldview in order, why it can be so difficult to let go of them if we've learned to believe that they are true. We all believe in some story or other about ourselves, about the people around us, about how the world works, and we all need stories like these. Now, some of them are harmless, some are helpful, and unfortunately some are incredibly destructive, like the ones that sent thousands of innocent people to their deaths in the witch hunts. And that's why, as uncomfortable as it might be at times, we need to look at our stories, examine them very closely to see how they work and what they really do. I didn't plan to be that deep there at the end. Here's a good little werewolf fact to lighten the mood before we dissemble this meeting. There are, in the Davidson text, reproductions of early modern illustrations of male witches riding to Sabbath on wolfback, and this is also something that was described repeatedly. And Sabbath is where the witch and demon orgies happen. So, well, allegedly, I've never been to one. I'm not a witch or a demon or a werewolf, so I'm not invited. And this is by recommendation of both people I talked to about the witches and the wolves at the orgies. Should you be an avid reader of the Omegaverse, you should probably check out some early modern werewolf lore. You'd love that shit, trust me. They do cool things like have orgies in the mountains, obviously, and then summon avalanches and stuff like that. Very metal, very fun. 10 out of 10 werewolves and werewolf lovers would recommend. And yeah, that's all I have to say today. Yeah, I'd love to hear what you think about this mechanism. Do you think that the mechanism that leads to these kind of supernatural explanations, do you think that is something that makes sense to apply to this story? Or do you think this is all bullshit? I don't know. Let me know. So, with that, I withdraw into the depths of my overgrown ruin of a house and let you gather on the lawn in the October mist and tell the tale of a strange midnight culture club that meets within its walls. Perhaps you've heard it's actually a cult or a coven of particularly warty witches and their dashing wolf companions, who knows? Tell the tale to a friend or your mum or your local eccentric lady. I feel like she might be the target audience. Stories are meant to be passed on, to be shared far and wide. It is the first rule of legend and the first rule of the Midnight Culture Club. Tell everyone about Midnight Culture Club. If oral storytelling is not your thing, you can also subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any episodes. Give it a rating at the top of a Spotify page or leave a comment about what you liked or didn't like about this episode. And you can follow the Midnight Culture Club on Instagram, where you can catch updates, glances behind the scenes, and visual material for some of the episodes. I might throw in an illustration of a wolf riding witch, and you wouldn't want to miss that, would you? So, thank you all for attending this meeting and lending your ear to this episode, and I hope to see you again soon, here on the nocturnal side. Sweet dreams and good night.